My name is Oluro Timiosha. I like to talk about American presidents and U.S. history and U.S. law and international human rights law. Right now, considering that America is embroiled in a war conflict, at least conflict, uh, with joint forces, joint Israeli forces against Iran, and there are concerns that this might escalate, in the age of nuclear weapons. Um, of course, I've been following the news and what's been going on. Considering I'm an American citizen, and of course, what America is doing in the world involves me as well. I recently read that the president of the U.S. military is intending to galvanize Kurds in Iran against the Iranian forces. Um, the Kurds are a separatist group in Iran. They're also in Iraq, so they are they're on the Iraq Iran border. So I got concerned about the talk um, plans to sponsor Kurds in Iran against the Iranian government, and it's just sort of it it raises you know concerns about what has happened in the past, right? This is redolent of what America did in the past. America has had a very long history and involvement in wars in the Middle East, and including inciting wars in the Middle East, and they haven't had uh, great ultimate outcomes. In the end, they've resulted in negative consequences for Americans. The U.S. military has been used sort of like mercenary forces in the Middle East, right? And it's had consequences for average Americans just living in America who just wants to go about his day, enjoy his liberty, and pursue happiness, uh, and his or her constitutional rights. So I want to quickly discuss. I'm going to try and keep this video short, and I'm going to talk about America's involvement in the Middle East and how that ended up having adverse consequences for Americans, and how this plan to incite or sponsor Kurds against the Iranian government is merely uh, like repeating, looks like history repeating itself, and it will end up having the same dire consequences. Um, so Kurds, by the way, they're Sunni. They're mainly Sunni Muslims as well. Just like wait, sorry, Kurds are mainly Sunni Muslims. I think and of course the Iranian government. They're Shia, right? They're Shia Muslims mainly. Um, so uh, in in 19 between 1979 and 1989, there was the Soviet-Afghan War, right? The Soviet-Afghan War. Of course, America just recently got out of Afghanistan after 20 years, and now when it left, the Taliban, you know, returned to power. Um, Prior to that, the U.S. was embroiled in the Cold War between the Cold War between the USA and the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, right? Um, and Of course, it ended up falling apart. That's the USSR. Ended up collapsing in 1991. The reason it's called the Cold War is because America and the USSR never actually engaged in direct conflict, but they used proxies, right? So the Vietnam War that America was engaged in for such a long time was an the undeclared war, American war, was a proxy war really between the USSR, which was supporting North Vietnam, and the USA, which supported South Vietnam. Only that the US ended up sending lots of men, military forces, soldiers on ground, and there were disastrous consequences. About, I think, 500,000 US soldiers were sent, foots on ground, and there were very disastrous repercussions as American civilians, youth would come out en masse protesting against the Lyndon B. Johnson and Nixon administrations because of the killing and the illegal war that was going on in Vietnam. And the American government, Lyndon B. Johnson's government, kept you know you know deceiving the American public, and of course there was what the media called the credibility gap. Now back to the Soviet-Afghan War. So America suffered a lot during the Vietnam War. So America was determined to make inflict its own Vietnam on the USSR. So, uh, and its instrumentality would be this Soviet-Afghan War. So America started to sponsor the Afghans, right, through the CIA and other covert means. They started to sponsor the Afghan freedom fighters. They were known as the Mujahideen, and amongst their leaders were Osama bin Laden. So that's how Osama bin Laden came about. And so America funneled billions of dollars and to the Mujahideen, and eventually America provided intelligence support, military, weapons and things like that, and of course funding, and eventually the the Afghans prevailed, and the Soviets were forced to withdraw in 1989. And this the defeats of the Soviet forces and the protracted war is supposed to have contributed to the collapse of the USSR in 1991, which is what America wanted. So that was successful, but it ended up having consequences, right? There were consequences because the Mujahideen, the Osama bin Laden, they went on to, they had nothing to do. This was 1990. They went on to form what was called Al Qaeda, right? We all know of Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda apparently means the base, right? So, and this was from the base of the database um, of fighters that were recruited by Osama bin Laden and his acolytes to fight in the Afghan war against the Soviets. So now, uh, since the Soviets had been defeated, America ended up withdrawing from American forces. America ended up withdrawing from Afghanistan, which left a vacuum. There was a power vacuum, and then there was a civil war as different factions were fighting for power, right, for control. And so uh, there was a civil war, and eventually the Taliban prevailed. Now we know what Al Qaeda ended up doing under Osama bin Laden, right? Osama bin Laden at some point offered his services to the Saudi government in order to protect the Saudi government against an impending imminent invasion uh, from Iraq under Saddam Hussein, right? Um, Osama bin Laden, his Mujahideen forces were in conflict with Saddam Hussein's Ba'athi forces. So Saddam Hussein, they were secularists. That was another force. They were a terrorist group. They had initially been, listed as a terrorist group, but something interesting happened. Um, they would get into a war that America incited, sort of encouraged a war with Iran, right? So there was the Iraq Iran war. This was between, this lasted a decade. The Iraq Iran war was between 1980 and 1988. America encouraged this Iran Iraq war to so that there would be no clear power in the Middle East, right? So to limit their power, to decimate their power in the Middle East, that's Iran and Iraq. So both of them were embroiled in a war for 8 years, Iran and Iraq. Interestingly, America was supporting Iraq. What is interesting is that uh, America's nemesis, the Soviet Union, was also supporting Iraq with weapons. So both America and the USSR, right, who were both in conflict in the Cold War, ended up supporting Iraq against Iran for 8 years. It is said that, in fact, America supplied some of the materials that America supplied to Iraq was used to create the chemical weapons that Saddam Hussein used against Iranians during that 8 year war, right? And of course, chemical weapons are prohibited, but that's another thing, consequence, something that America has to watch out in the asymmetrical warfare against Iran. Because I've been seeing on TV Iranian um, government officials claiming that America used, sponsored, helped Iraq use chemical weapons against Iranians. Uh, they blame the blame of, uh, the exposure to chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq war. They blame the blame on Americans, right? So in the asymmetrical warfare that they're going to engage in with America, since it's no holds barred, so since America has violated international law by engaging in political assassinations of leaders, right, violating the sovereignty, America has not adhered to international law. They've violated jus ad bellum, right? They've had no justification for going to war. In fact, American, leaders are politicians, Congress said it that, well, we had no justification for war. You can expect Iranians to engage in. Uh, they might use biological and chemical weapons. So these are the dangers that American forces will be exposed to should they put their boots out. Should they go invade Iran, right? So hopefully this war stops. America disengages itself from this war very soon. Hopefully. Um, My father used to tell me something: don't throw good money after bad money, right? So if America can't lose a war that it disengages itself from immediately, we don't want to get involved in a protracted war, especially since we've used it in the past. We've manipulated, right, engineered protracted wars between our adversaries in order to reduce their power, to decimate their power. This was what America did when it got the Soviet Union embroiled in a protracted war against the Afghans. And this led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So America shouldn't allow itself to be led, right, misled, in, into engaging in an unnecessary and protracted war with Iran or in the Middle East, right? So it's never too late to just get out. Um, so anyway, continuing with the war, the Iran-Iraqi war. So even though both America and the Soviet Union supported Iraq against Iran, they ended up achieving a stalemate. Iranians, if you ask Iranians, they say they defeated Iraq. If you ask Iraq, the Iraqis, they say they defeated Iran. But the reality is there was a stalemate because neither force ended up achieving its objective. So they, you know, they went back to the pre-war pre-existing pre-war borders, right? So they didn't achieve their goals. Saddam Hussein was not toppled; he remained in power, but this also ended up putting the Iraqis in tremendous debt. Saddam Hussein and his country got into tremendous debt from all the loans, the billions of dollars were provided to Saddam, to the Iraqis in the Iran-Iraq war by the US and the Soviet forces. The impoverishment of Iraq was what ended up causing Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait, right? And that led to the United States under President George H.W. Bush to lead, was it about 35 nations against Iraqi in the Gulf War, or Operation Desert Storm, in which Saddam Hussein was expelled from Kuwait, uh, you know. And of course, later on in 2003, with the feigned fabricated weapons of mass destruction narrative, the United States went into invaded Iraq and defeated, Iraqi forces, occupied Iraq, and Saddam Hussein was eventually was captured by U.S. forces, but executed by his own people, fellow Iraqis, an Iraqi kangaroo court. So, and in terms of Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden had been repelled, been rebuffed, rejected by his own people. Of course, Osama bin Laden came from a very prosperous Saudi family, and he had offered to protect, the Saudi government against an invasion by Saddam Hussein. Of course, the Al Qaeda, the Mujahideen, they hated the Ba'athis, they hated Saddam Hussein. Osama bin Laden uh, hated Saddam Hussein, but the Saudi Arabian government refused uh, the offer of Osama bin Laden to protect them, and instead they chose the military assistance of the United States government. And this may have been in part responsible for Osama bin Laden targeting, um, the United States as, the U.S. military uh, military's gain in funds from the Saudi government was a loss for his organization, which he turned into a terrorist group against the West in his bid for a global jihad. So, idle hands are the devil's workshop, right? So they had been trained for warfare, and once that war stopped, they had to continue warfare in some other arena, and in this case, the West were targeted. So my point is, in history in the Middle East, America has funneled funds and used pawns to achieve its limited objectives, whether it's the Mujahideen, which created Osama bin Laden, or uh, or the Iraqis under Saddam Hussein, only for these two groups to end up going to war against America, and American military being forced to destroy them. So now, when America starts to fund the Kurds in Iran, a separatist group, against the Iranian government, what is going to happen in future? What are the long-term consequences, right? Because in history, you just don't want to have a case of history repeating itself and America never learning from its mistakes, right? America never learning from its mistakes, you know. So America uh, hasn't had a great um, track record in its long involvement in the Middle East, right? We're just it's in the Middle East. America's involvement in the Middle East is always like a case of one step forward, two steps backward, right? Robbing Peter to pay Paul. That's an idiom I can think of. I'm looking for an idiom that I can use regarding America's activities in the Middle East. We rob Peter to pay Paul, or we cut off, cutting off one's nose to spite one's face. That's what happens. Uh, that's the fallout, the blowback in terms of America's involvement in the Middle East. Now, America has all these bases in the Middle East, and the Iranian military is attacking those bases. We've already lost some lives, right? May their soul rest in peace. There's a huge damage to our reputation. We're now living in the world of instant communication, right? It's no longer an age in which, like, it's no longer like the era of the civil of the Vietnam War, when the government could just mislead, could fabricate information, could provide disinformation, misinformation to the public, and the public doesn't know what's going on, which is what the Lyndon administration did during Vietnam. Lyndon, America kept telling the public that, well, America's winning the Vietnam War, that we're doing very well. Meanwhile, there were all these body bags they were hiding from the public, right? Our soldiers were dying, they were being traumatized. There was a lot of invidious stuff going on in Vietnam until this guy called Daniel, he'd been a Pentagon analyst, right? He'd been in the military, very brilliant guy, PhD from Harvard, Daniel Ellsberg. He decides to go and leak classified information, publishing the Pentagon papers, that to demonstrate that even America's military leaders did not believe they could win the Vietnam War, but Americans were sending its young men and women to go and die, you know, in the thousands in Vietnam, right? Congress was spending billions of dollars in Vietnam. So that era has changed. Now it's the era of instant communication, the internet, right? The American public immediately knows what's going on in the world, in the Middle East. And we know we have real time um, access to the repercussions of war. And we can't easily be deceived, right? So things are different now, So, what are our objectives in going to the Middle East, in fighting Iran? Does America intend to to weak? I mean, when I assess the real politic of President Trump and his leadership, his cabinet, because it looks like that's the only strategy they seem to be pursuing, right? The only uh, philosophy they seem to be pursuing, real politic, that, well, they have this power and they're just going to use that power and diminish the capacity of their rivals. Because I keep thinking of China. Both America has just attacked both of China's main partners, right? Venezuela was in partnership with China in supplying oil, right? Um, I think China was the biggest buyer of Venezuelan oil, and of course, Venezuela has the most proven oil reserves in the world. Iran is also a partner of both China and Russia, and Iran has the third biggest proven oil reserves in the world, the third, right? But Iran has been in this impasse with America for a long time. So, in a way, America has outright used its military might to immediately attack two, two supports, two associates or whatever, through um, two major allies of its rival, China, right, that have significant oil wealth. So, in a way, that should weaken China's access to oil. That should weaken China in a bit, but it's weakening America as well, right? It's weakening. It's costing America as well, and China's not involved in any. Is not involved in any war that's you know it's costing it. It's costing America to engage in these um, military interventions that have no end game, right? And it's damaging America's reputation, right? Um, China is now, in contrast to America, um, looking like a respectable member of the international community instead of the rogue state or rogue player or the evil nation that propagate, Western propaganda has tried to frame it as. America is now looking like um, the bully in the schoolyard, right? Or the like a bull, like a bull in a china shop. That's dangerous and has to be contained. That's what America is looking like now. In this, it's making these. They seem to be like this possessor of so much military power and nuclear weapons that's making these erratic steps that just don't seem to be, you know, well thought out, or seem to be knee-jerk reactions with such vast military resources and might that will end up having very severe long-term repercussions. And we've seen from history what America's past actions in the Middle East, the long-term repercussions it had in the world, in the Middle East, and against Americans. Americans have suffered, right? Americans suffered in by going to war in the Gulf War and the Iraqi invasion of 2003. America suffered from the Al Qaeda um, attack in September 11, 2001. The American public that is just, we're not causing any problem in the world. We're just interested in exercising our liberties, paying our taxes, and pursuing our constitutional rights to pursue happiness, right? Anyway, let me stop this video here. I don't want to get to 30 minutes. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.